Could you imagine having a double lung transplant, right? So you're out, you are sleeping, you're ready for this thing to be over with, and all of a sudden your surgeon releases a clamp too soon that causes you to bleed out. But even worse, could you imagine that happening while all of a sudden you become aware that you're on an operating table with medical professionals scrambling to save you? And then all of a sudden you're transported to a blinding light where you think you see an angel. I could not imagine that, but we are going to talk about that here today and subsequently with the Bright Lights Beyond podcast.
Let me give you a little bit about who I am. My name is Lexie Garrett. I am from the great state of Texas, and I am here with my lovely co-host, Marina, and we are going to talk to you guys about near-death experiences, lovingly referred to as NDEs.
I am Marina. Like Lexie said, we are super interested in near-death experiences, but we do not know a lot about them. So this podcast journey is going to take us as much on the path of learning as it is for our listeners. I hail from Louisville, Kentucky, and moved to Chicago a couple years ago, and Lexie and I have a shared love of the great beyond of learning cool stuff. So it's kind of where we came together. So let's figure out what these things are.
Over the summer 2 years ago, I watched this documentary on Discovery Plus, and not a promo. They do not pay us.
Not a sponsor.
Yeah, not sponsored yet. But I watched this documentary on Discovery Plus, and it was just kind of talking about the afterlife and people who have crossed over, come back, or people who have just, passed on. And the whole point of the documentary was kind of to bring some sort of comfort to people who are living here on Earth about what's going to happen when we pass on, which is something that, sure, we can put out of our brain, but ultimately we are all kind of like worried and have like death anxiety in a way. And so when I watched this, I almost had this like sense of like, wow, like, maybe it's not as bad. And I decided to look into NDEs, which are near-death experiences. And what we found was super interesting and something that, like you said, we don't really know a whole, like that's not our background. But in looking at it, I feel like I found a lot of comfort. And so that's why I wanted to do this podcast. And I know that you also have similar views on that. So that's just a little bit kind of why I personally wanted to do this podcast.
Yeah, and I think similarly, it's something that is very interesting to me. A little backstory, it's kind of a sad story, but I was holding my grandfather when he passed away, and it was very, very quick, and it was so interesting to me that like in the blink of an eye, your body becomes not your soul. And I'm always so curious of like in those moments, what was he experiencing? And I think that's why it seems to be such a universal thing, regardless of your religion or your beliefs of afterlife. It's just nice to think about like that we all can have these experiences and that people can have them and then come back, and that they're shared experiences and that they can bond over these things, because funny enough, their symptoms are all super similar, which is really kind of cool.
Yeah, no, and that's part of the reason why it's like so interesting. And when you look into it, I feel like there's a lot of things of like, the afterlife and stuff, but like near-death experiences are so universal and so transformative for everybody who's involved, whether you experience it, whether you believe that it's spiritual or it's, naturalism's involved, like whatever you believe, it's universal in a way and it transforms you. I was watching this professor of philosophy from the University of California at Riverside, and his name was John Fisher. And he was kind of talking about the transformative aspects of near-death experiences. And he comes from an academic sense, which is not necessarily something that I think a lot of people think about when they think of like spirituality or like near-death or like crossing over and stuff. And he was really talking about how it's less about whether you believe in near-death experiences, that they're spiritual, and more about what happens after someone has a near-death experience and like what transforms them and what we can all kind of like liken it to. And he kind of talks about how in the end, like people, and the more studies they're doing, like people need to be with people when they're passing on because it's like a comfort aspect. And he mentions that in a lot of literature, like there's voyages, like people will go on journeys and they have this like higher being or like a god tells them, or just, you know, like the Odyssey, like you're going across this whatever. And that's kind of what a near-death experience is. Like you have this voyage that you're going on and you have someone like Jesus or your mom or your best friend who's passed on guiding you through this. And it's some kind of transformative journey that you may not see the end of, but when you come back, it's like a comfort almost.
Yeah, that makes me think of, this is going to be a total spoiler alert, but have you seen the show 6 Feet Under?
No, what is that?
So we're going to talk about this and then absolutely forget it so that you go on HBO and watch it.
Okay.
So the whole show deals with death, and it's all about this family who owns a funeral home. And one of the things about the show is that at the beginning of every episode, a death happens, and then they are dealing with the dead body throughout the episode. So the end of the show is one of the characters, her name is Claire, she's driving, and it's basically like she's experiencing a near-death experience, like she's driving to, you know, the beyond part. And so then the whole sequence that happens is like her life flashes before her eyes, and she sees her entire life. So I've always kind of thought of near-death experiences like 6 Feet Under's finale, and like you will see everything in your life. But I guess that's not necessarily everybody's experience.
You know, actually, good thing you brought that up, because throughout this podcast, we're going to be talking about different, I want to say like vocabulary words, but like you don't have to write them down and highlight them or whatever. But
study, there will be a quiz in 2 episodes.
Yes, make sure that you guys truly know what we're talking about. But there are some characteristics that near-death experiences have, and one of them is actually a life in review, which is something that does happen to a majority. Now, a lot of times it's like pick and choose like which near-death experience like attributes that you have during yours, but that is actually one of them. It ranges obviously, but they're out-of-body experiences that are referred to as OBEs. You normally feel like pleasant, you see a tunnel or a light, you're seeing deceased relatives or maybe like a religious figure like God, a life in review, which is what you were referring to, and then a conscious return to your body, which is super crazy. And I don't even know like what that looks like other than like I can kind of picture it in my brain. But those are kind of some characteristics that happen often when you experience near death.
And I think it's cool that not cool. I hate that this happens for anybody,
right,
to be honest. But a lot of people have had so many of those similar things that they've created stages of near-death experiences, which I did some research on that. So the first stage would be a sudden and peaceful relief from pain. So in the example in the opening, the person, there was a clamp issue, started bleeding out. That person left that pain. There was no longer a part of their body. Then perception of relaxing sounds or otherworldly music comes in. So they're getting their iTunes in. Then
or Spotify.
Yes, not a sponsor either. Then it's consciousness or spirit ascending above the person's body and remotely viewing the attempts of resurrection from the ceiling. So it's that old, you're in a hospital being worked on and somebody's above you and it's you looking at you, that kind of experience, which is depicted a lot in TV, but people experience that in real life. And then they arrive at a brilliant heavenly place. And a lot of the times people will say, whatever that place is to them, it's very colorful. It's brighter than normal. They feel a sense of warmth when they're there. There's a lot of these like seemingly positive attributes when you hit that place. Then you're met with the people of the light. And like you said, they could be deceased family members or friends, or just maybe your depiction of what that otherworldly being is in that moment, whatever you're experiencing. And then I think this is really cool, the meeting of a deity that is often perceived just as their religious culture would have been perceived. It's that, that love and light and angel kind of thing. And then the person returns to their earthly body in life because either they are told it's not their time or they're given a choice and they choose to want to be with their family and friends and continue with their life for as long as they have. So those are kind of like the standard stages. I think people don't always experience them all, or some people, over experience more than that. But it's kind of cool that they were able to determine that.
No, yeah, that's really amazing, and it's just so crazy how, maybe they don't experience all of them, but enough of people have experienced this and also live to tell the tale or have these communities where they talk about it and it's like the exact same thing. And so this philosopher that I listened to and got a lot of information from, he wanted to look at the naturalistic part of near-death experiences. Which I don't know if you've caught on yet, but we call them NDEs. So
get with the lingo because it's going to be NDE Central in here.
Yes, totally. And that is on your quiz. So be sure to write that down. So I feel like with near-death experiences, and maybe I do sound crazy in saying this, but almost like with near-death experiences, like an acid trip or something, like it's, that it's not necessarily like really what's happening. Like you're taking a hallucinogen. So it's not like actually happening in real life, but when you come off the trip or come out of it, you're changed, and those things did happen to you in your mind. And so he likens it almost to that, where it's like, yes, these things didn't physically happen to you, but mentally you felt them happening, and that's all you needed for it to be real. And so whether you believe that near-death experiences are real and they actually happen and there is a great beyond, or you just believe that this is something that's chemically happening to your brain when it experiences trauma, either way, you are transformed by the end of it. And that is the beautiful thing about it, is that whether it's real, not, you believe in it, you think that the aliens are coming or that we're all going to heaven, it is something that transforms you and gives you comfort. And I feel like that's what's the most amazing thing about learning this, is that in the end, everyone's transformed, whether you believe it's spiritual or natural. Which I think is super, super cool and so special to this phenomena just in general.
And when Lexie brought up this topic as like a potential idea for a podcast, I think I was so drawn to it because I love the idea of second chances. And first of all, you're getting a second chance of life because these people live to tell the tale and they are experiencing this stuff, in this great way, these horrible experiences. So like, they almost die. They basically, some people flatline and they are able to come back with a great outlook on life. That's so incredible. So like you said, regardless of the reason behind it, there's something so special about getting that experience like on top of a bad experience.
100%. And that's something that, just in the research that we've done, we've noticed that the people who experience NDEs have a very, very transformative come back to life, and they live almost completely different lives. Like, there are attributes that are attributed to having near-death experience and the transformation that happens. A lot of times people become more spiritual once they go through these near-death experiences. Mm-hmm. A lot of times people will become closer to their family and care more and care more about these interpersonal relationships and are actually more social. And they also have way less death anxiety than people who don't experience this. And whether you've experienced it yourself or been around or just learned about it, I feel like it brings some type of healing and comfort to you, because we all are going to experience death. And even if you're Elon Musk and like planning on like freezing your head on ice like Disney or whatever, like everyone does die. And so it's comforting to know that people have gone before you. People are going to be there with you, leading you through it. And I think that's why it's so important that these people's lives change, but then the people around them change and they just have a totally different outlook.
So my husband was an extra on Chicago PD a couple years ago, and he got to do he was playing like a tech support specialist. And so he got to work with the actor who plays Hank Voight, which is like the main actor of the show. And it's like the older guy with the gravelly voice. And they were on like a lunch break. And so Mitch sat at the table with him, and he was talking about how he died, he did have a near-death experience. And everything that he does now, he does with grace and with, appreciation for the life that he has. And after this happened, he went on to be a very successful actor. So it like took away the fear of living to just be able to live the life you want to live. And look at him. This is like one of the main actors on Chicago PD. I don't know how accurate the specifics of the story are, but
very accurate. If anybody's fact checking, it's super, we vetted it.
If that fear of death is gone, then living becomes the goal.
Life is for the living. I mean, you hear that phrase all the time. And I think that near-death experience and people who experience it is just like a nice reminder for people to remember that you have to live your life. And yes, obviously we all have some type of like immortality complex and we all want to live forever in some facet or another. But in the very end, like, that's just life. It's unique to being human. Like, I don't necessarily know if deers have near-death experiences and transcend their body and come back. Like, I don't know. But I know that humans do, and it's a uniquely human experience.
It's funny you bring that up because it's not been a uniquely human experience recently. It goes back a very long time. And so some of the near-death experiences can date back to the 1740s. That was the earliest recorded near-death experience. So it dates back quite a while, and it goes back to France. So some of the things I'm going to say, I'm going to butcher the French pronunciation, so I'm very sorry. This will not be on the quiz. But the report was written by Pierre-Jean du Moncon. And he was a military physician who wrote this book about anecdotes with medicine. And he speculated that it was too much blood flowing to the brain and it was cutting off oxygen, but just too much going on up there. But it was because of this person who was a famous apothecary, pharmacist, and this person fell unconscious, and he reported that he saw a light so pure that he thought it must have been heaven. And that's kind of how it started. And then, of course, people have been having these experiences plenty of years before and plenty of years after, but that was the first time that they were like, well, let's try and figure out what this was. And so immediately they went to medicine. It wasn't instantly like, oh, this is a spiritual thing. It was immediately, how did the brain do this? So I think that's super interesting too, that it was becoming a medical thing right away.
Speaking of people trying to put this in medical terminology, in my research I found, which I don't know if this is just the irony of life or just like maybe the aliens knew what they were doing when they implanted the chips or whatever, but a lot of neuropsychologists, neuroscientists, and brain surgeons actually have near-death experiences. What just kind of like, it's like, what? These are people that you'd consider being like, oh no, it's like very medical and clinical terms of why you saw yourself floating above yourself. But no, that's not. In my research, I found this one neuroscientist. Her name is Jill Bolt Taylor, and she wrote a book recently about a stroke she had, and it was called My Stroke of Insight, and that's what the book is called. She was saying that when she had her stroke, her brain was totally offline. She said that even though her body and brain, like physical brain, wasn't really working, her mind was still active. And so that kind of leads to this whole thing of like your body, your physical body, and your mind, your mind's eye, that kind of stuff isn't necessarily the same thing. Like, that was something that I found interesting in looking at this, because your body, like, for example, half the stories you read about with people going through windshields and hitting trees and then waking up 2 months later in a coma, in the hospital and being like, no, I was like dead and I went over, and all these things that we hear about, it's because our mind isn't necessarily gone when we are. To put it plainly, near-death experiences don't necessarily tell us where we're going, but they kind of tell us that we will be going somewhere. In the very least, that we're not alone in going to that place, which I think is really important. So the voyage that we're about to embark on, hopefully for a very long time, and maybe even longer if Elon Musk can get it together. But the journey that we're about to embark on, we're not going to be doing it alone. And so I think that's the most comforting part, and that's kind of like what I really want to look into and kind of share with you guys. And I think that that's the most important thing, is that no matter where we're going to go somewhere, and we're not going to be alone.
And I absolutely think that doing this podcast together is a great way to connect. And I think that's the whole thing with near-death experiences that you touched on, of creating these communities afterwards, and you're building networks of people who have had similar experiences. And that right there just tells you that you're not alone, and you're not going to be alone when you experience death or when you experience life, which is the most important part.
I'm excited for you guys to listen, and I'm excited to hear what you guys' thoughts are. Hopefully this can bring a little levity to a really kind of unsure topic, which is like death. And that's not something that I personally like to talk about a lot, because I'm like always making jokes about everything, even if it's not funny. But I think that, you know, looking at this can maybe help you guys, and maybe we can all find a community in this.
So speaking of community, the best way to see us along with hear us is to follow us on Instagram. We created an Instagram page a little bit back, so we're pretty new on content, but we're going to have a lot of stuff coming your way. At Bright Lights Beyond is how you can follow us.
We follow for follow, like for like, so be sure to drop your handle, I guess, or just follow us, because I don't know what drop your handle means.
Yeah, and we're a community, so we want your input. Please comment, like, we'll comment and like you back, and all that fun stuff. We're going to be experiencing it together. Not to plug another podcast, but I loved listening to like Serial on NPR, where I feel like they were going through the podcast journey and the journalist journey at the same time as the listeners were.
Totally.
And so I feel like we're kind of in that same boat. You probably know as a listener as much as we do about NDEs. So we're going to kind of figure it out together. We are going on a not near death, but we are going on an experience together.
Yes.
We're never going to come to terms with death. That's not something that's going to
Right.
probably happen within the course of our podcast. As much
Say
as
it
we would
ain't
love to
so.
be your therapists and our own therapists, that's probably not going to happen.
True.
But it would be nice to get a positive perspective on death. And I don't think you see that a lot. I think we get a lot of murder podcasts. We get a lot of very negative things. We don't get a lot of positive when it comes to death. And while we're not going to be specifically talking about death, some of these people do die.
Yeah.
And they come back.
Yeah.
So that right there is a death experience.
Right.
So I hope that we can bring some positivity to this thing that we're all nervous
Absolutely.
and scared about.
Thank you guys for sticking with us for this much anticipated podcast. We're super excited. Live life beyond.